Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've recently been approached and asked, how did I become an integralist? And, that's an interesting question because how does anybody become an integralist, or even more so, how does one become a monarchist? Now, I don't proclaim to be a monarchist per se, mainly because I think there's more a practical effect to being an integralist in today's society, which boasts, of course, the concepts of self-autonomy in regards to politics. And as a practical matter, I think, integralism, there's a more, malleable way that we can deal with governance in society and how we build something better and stronger. For me, it's like everything else in life and everything I try and do on this show. I think a lot of us are our life experiences. I think that forms a lot of who I am, about my beliefs and how they've evolved over the years. I've talked a lot about how I came from the classical liberal camp, right? That right-wing camp, growing up really coming to my political curiosity in the early 90s, or really getting into politics more directly in the mid 90s. My experience begins really during that Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky affair when I was going to college. And that's where my political curiosity began. And, growing up in a Sicilian family, I have what I consider unique perspective. And it's unique in the sense, not because, Sicilians or Italians are necessarily unique in America and our experience, unique in the sense that I maintain the faith and I view life in the prisms of this world from more of an old world view. And I do it out of respect for my faith and a respect for my family, a respect for my ancestors, something that I have always sort of cherished in my life as the most important thing that there is. I think for Italians, oftentimes, and Sicilians, especially those that have had the immigrant experience, it just matters if the faith has survived intact in a very liberal society like America, and how that translates into your life today. Because as I've talked about so many times before, we're living in a time of great apostasy, and how you view faith, God, family, and ultimately the order within society, or how the structures of society are supposed to apply to us all. It matters how we view that. For me, the liberal society of freedom, liberty, whatever the intentions were, whether it was of the founding or of the classical liberal movement, the founding fathers, America in its infancy, America in its, whatever it may be, I always saw that idea always devolve into sort of moral degeneracy. Now, the intentions, I will admit, might have not been there at the beginning. But for me, when you don't have an answer, a resolution to how to deal with these contradictions between proper and just order, morality, and really the chaos that is built in society over the past 150 years, that's a problem. I'm a guy that needs an answer to these rather than just, go along just to get along. And I think that's what we've become as a society. We're going along just to get along because nobody wants to deal with the hard realities of life. And so my experiences formed me who I was. The first of which, and I think this is very important, where I think a lot of Americans, particularly, kind of, how should I say this, lose the faith or even lose the understanding of old world structures, is the fact that the family is broken down. I came from a family that was intact. So an idea like the familial system, as we solve something in the old world, is very familiar to me. I've said it many times, one of the phrases that a lot of Americans use is the word old school, right? That's what we use to describe something that's kind of more traditional in an American sense. But For us Italians and Sicilians, our word we use is Old World. And Old World is a whole different concept how we look at things, because not only does it imply something of the past, something inherent to tradition, but also something inherent to a culture and certain religious principles that go deeper and even beyond logic and reason, right? Where logic and reason plays a big role, there's a certain understanding of the spiritual nature of the world that we always apply in the Old World, because the Old World never separated the physical from the spiritual. We understood it was both and that's part of being Catholic. Let's be honest here, where it's neither the logic and reason alone or the spirituality alone. It's balancing the two. And our world today is actually different because it's separated the spiritual from the material, from the natural. And in that respect, it becomes a society based upon not just logic or reason, but ultimately it becomes a society built on impulses, particularly material impulses or natural impulses for that matter. Well, the Old World taught us to deny that, taught us that some of those things to the extreme are a bad thing. Today's world teaches us that those impulses and the desire for the material world is a good thing, and we shouldn't deny those things. And I think those are the experiences that I lived. I think from my youngest age, what I remember being Sicilian, and this is important, it formed me early on the way I think, right? You know, when my parents got to this country, we were very thankful and appreciative for the opportunities that we had here because of the problems that we're having in Italy and Sicily. Now, the problems in Italy and Sicily are byproduct of other political structures that had infected Italy after World War II. I'll get into that some other time. It's not a situation where Italy in and of itself is dysfunctional, as many classical liberals like to talk about Europe in general post-World War II. The problems of Italy and the structural problems of Italy, I should say, were a byproduct of post-Enlightenment society, the infusion of liberalism, the infusion of democracy that really forces many Europeans to flee, particularly from southern Italy, because southern Italy is a very agricultural area. And within the framework of those structures, or should I say that poverty, I should say, many people begin to flee for greener pastures, starting with, Italians fleeing for Argentina and America and different parts of the world because of the excess poverty. And I think that's very important to remember. It's like historian Charles Coulomb said, before the unification of Italy, which was let's call it 1860s, right around there, 1870s, right around there, hardly any Italians left Italy. And why would they? It's kind of a strange thing because we're familially based, right? Families stay together generally, right? We didn't have this globalist economy where you just, okay, mom, dad, I'm 18, I'm heading to Chicago, New York, Bangladesh, whatever it is to make the money. It was more of an agricultural society. Families, even extended families, stayed closer together within time and space and distance and things like that. But the economy post-revolutionary Europe made that impossible, particularly in more agricultural, more religious sectors of Europe. And that's important to remember and understand that context, which we'll get into at other times because there's too much to talk about now, is very important. But I think one of the strangest things for me was, I remember my parents coming to this country, being very loyal to the country, and appreciative and thankful for the country. We had fundamental differences with the greater pluralistic culture at large. Coming from a predominantly Catholic area where I was born and raised in Los Angeles, we intermixed with other cultures, obviously, right? Again, America being this bastion of pluralism, we had to make our way and respect other cultures, other religions, other beliefs, right? Particularly in Southern California, evangelical was a big presence there. Hispanics were a big presence there, and liberalism was really starting to show its head, and how we intermix with these different ideologies. And being Italian of itself and having these stronger familial bonds that we have, and remember going to grade school and remember thinking to myself, or should I say, meeting friends that were of a non-Catholic nature that came from broken homes. And that's the interesting thing about it, was that those that I engaged in at a very young age that came from non-Catholic families were the families that predominantly had, well, let's just say from our perspective, unorthodox familial structures. Divorces, remarriage. I spend the weekends with dad, and then I travel across town and I spend the weekend or the rest of the week with mom. I got 2 Christmases, that kind of stuff. And it was weird as a young man thinking to myself, wait a minute, how are these families split? There's something wrong, especially because for us Catholics, divorce is considered a mortal sin. You just don't do it. But in American society, it doesn't work that way, because under the constructs of sort of this Protestant Freemasonic ideology in America that liberalizes everything, that categorizes everything under the concepts of freedom and liberty, your right to divorce, if you're unhappy, is part of your liberty in America, which sets up this fundamental contradiction between, freedom, liberty, and then order on the other side. And these structures in America often contradicted each other, because for Catholics, our first duty is to God, and the family is supposed to represent God. Who are the role models for Catholics? Well, it's the Holy Family, right? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. They are the sort of the ideal of what the family structure looks like, and the bonds that they represented, and the structures, the order and the structures of the faith that they represented. Whether it was, again, the bonds of marriage, raising a child, having a family with Jesus, of course, and then fulfilling the laws of God, taking, Jesus to be circumcised and eventually into the temple, and the structures and the order that the Holy Family had in their lives. Not just a visible structure, okay, mother, father, child, nuclear family, more than that, but the structure and the laws that they followed for God. There wasn't claims of freedom, liberty, and ultimately this, how should I put this, these claims of suppression and claiming for rights. It was a matter of, this is the order of family, and these are the structures we follow with God. And that's what Catholicism is. And that's why within Catholicism, the family is the center of our civilization, not the ideals of freedom, liberty, and certain rights, and this self-autonomy, or this extreme self-autonomy where I get to serve myself first and foremost, right? Family is the fundamental structure of society. And with that comes the concept of sacrifice that really works oftentimes against the nature of self-autonomy and the freedom and liberty that Americans, cherish as their great virtue. Because ultimately, and these are the things that I found out later on that were quite odd and quite strange within the realm of conservatives, is on one hand, conservatives claim, here we got the individual, the individual autonomy, right? Individual autonomy is sacred, it's cherished, you get to do what you want, nobody can tell you what to do, kiss my ass, I'm an American. But on the other hand, conservatives also believe in order, which is interesting in and of itself, because with conservatives, and this is what I found out later on, there's this tug of war between self-autonomy and doing what is right, the greater social structures, and within that framework. And where oftentimes, and again, now this is later on in life, what I figured out was within the realm of this contradictions, conservatives can't control this, because in denying the fallen nature, where conservatives believe man's fallen nature can be harnessed through things like work or the economy or making money, we Catholics believe we cannot overcome our fallen nature without God, the church, and the sacraments. And since we've broken away from those old structures where the church was in place, where the church played a fundamental role, where the sacraments were there to guide us and help us deal with our fallen nature, our fallen passions, conservatives try to work that out in an earthly way, right? In a material way in this life. And they'll tell you that, working hard, the Protestant work ethic or the Calvinist work ethic is a byproduct of this indifferent faith within America. And as long as you're always working and making money, that in itself is a way for you to sort of overcome that fallen nature. But that really hasn't worked out in that capacity. And I think part of the reason, or how we see that, is the fact that the frameworks of Protestant theology has fallen apart. And as indifferentism has kicked in, it's led to lots of fundamental structural breakdowns, particularly within the family. That's why at the end of the day, and again, I noticed this at a very young age, the one thing Americans don't do well. You could tell me they make the money. You could tell me we live the greatest life in the history of the world and the economic engine of prosperity and how good life is and the comforts and the pleasures and all that stuff. But the one thing that I learned early on as a young man, or even as a young boy, was Americans don't know how to keep their families together. And they're really piss poor at it, if you think about it, right? And this is not just a byproduct of the left. It's a byproduct of the right in America too. See, the left breaks down social structures. It breaks down, sort of our fallen nature and appeals to our fallen nature. That's why we're always dealing with these sexual mores that are being attacked by the left. The right does it with economic policies. And again, goes back to this ghostly Calvinist past of the Protestant work ethic. And the right has never been able to get a hold of that, because what has happened, because the Calvinists essentially made work into an idol that they related back to God, and I would claim a false God. Americans have turned work and materialism into a God in their own right. That's why when you talk to a classical liberal today and you ask them, right, America, the greatest country in the history of the world. Well, why? Why? Well, I mean, for a guy that listened to Rush Limbaugh for a good decade and a half, probably, every time that subject came up, the subject was always centered around materialism and these abstract concepts of freedom and liberty. Freedom and liberties, some that are good, without a doubt. We all have fundamental freedom that are sort of, that God gives us in that sense, gives us a divine right to. But there's also freedoms that break down cohesion, society, and the family in and of itself. And that's what conservatives have never been able to govern. And part of the reason is because they gravitated toward heretical beliefs, starting with things like Calvinism and the Calvinist or the American work ethic that turns work into an idol rather than worshiping the one true God revealed through divine revelation in the 2,000-year analogy of the faith. That's why for Americans, the material aspect of the world is the greatness of America. And everything is related back to economic or material success at the expense of the spiritual. And why Americans have sold their souls eventually for this, again, acceptance of extreme materialism, right? It's a lack of balance in many respects by sort of the American way of life that never took true religion seriously, gave us abstract concepts of this, kind of personal Jesus thing, mixed in with Masonic values, and then trying to balance what the real world throws at us. And so when you're an immigrant and you come from a strong line of or culture of Catholic familial sort of governance, and you come to America and you see the Protestant families immediately breaking down, you sense, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, there's something different. How is it that this is breaking down in America so much more faster than, say, the old world where you came from? Because remember, up until really the end of World War II, you still had those pockets of Christendom that reigned throughout all of Europe. Sicily still had some of that. And that's why some have argued, and I agree with this assessment, that World War I and World War II, as America entered into it for ideological reasons. We could talk about the international bankers, we could talk about the finance part of it, we could talk about Hitler and the Jews and things like that. But part of that entry, or a big part of that problem that we've never talked about in sort of Western liberal tradition, is the fact that both classical liberalism and Marxism in the East allied together to put the final touches or the final crushing blow on Christendom. That was a factor that nobody wants to talk about except for us here. Well, there's a few other integralist thinkers that will bring that up. And so this plays a role in it. And it's interesting because, as I said so many times before, my experience within that first generation of immigration, we saw this great shift between what I call white and Black Protestants and then Catholics, Catholic communities. My exposure was in the South Bay area of Los Angeles. The mix of cultures were Italian, Croatians, and Hispanics that were Catholics, and then you had the white and Black Protestants. In my experience, this is anecdotal, I'm just telling you right now, within one generation, or at least within the first few years post-immigration, we saw those Protestant families begin to break down. That's where the problems were. Where within the framework of the Italian, Croatian, and even Hispanic families that were Catholic, their family structures were strong, solid. They were there. See, I don't believe it's a race issue. I believe it's a religious issue. I've always argued that on that show. And while the liberal society wants to bring up all these structures about race and things of that nature, or how we're divided by ideology and political principles, the big differences have always been within the framework of religion. And if you notice, not just on the left, but on the right, nobody wants to talk about these religious differences. And part of it has to do with the founding, right? Because we took an indifferent approach toward it, right? I mean, we have no explicit mention of Christianity or Jesus Christ in the Constitution, all right? We have this abstract, what I believe is the Masonic reference to the Creator. Yeah, sure, they might have took some Bible verses here and there, and the Bible played a role, but again, that only fuels even greater questions about Protestant dogma and doctrines and the chaos that was soon ensued, particularly in America, right? And that's a problem. And we could talk about that some other time, because that's another topic in itself. But here we are, you know, and we're getting along with other fellow Catholics within a framework, again, very anecdotal here. And we see structure, familial systems, strong familial bonds within Catholic families, and the Protestant families, a whole different ballgame. And that was sort of my first exposure that I noticed. And that's fine. You know, we got along with everybody. We did the best we could. You know, for a bunch of, of us immigrants, or I'm not an immigrant, I was actually born in this country. We understood, we kept our heads down, we worked hard, we fulfilled our duties to our country in that respect, respected the laws, but we saw there was differences. And for my part, even from a very young age, I saw that these differences were going to have strong ramifications later on in our culture. Here we are, I'm 50 years old now, and I've seen the complete meltdown of American culture. Now, a lot of these problems, again, are happening in Europe too, because of liberalization, the Enlightenment, post-World War II democracy has infected the world. And so this is just one small example here. But that's one of the things that kind of formed me, molded me as a young man to think to myself, wait a minute, American structure of governance and culture society is fundamentally different than Italian culture and how I was raised in many respects from the old world. And we dealt with it, we respected it. We're law-abiding citizens, what we do. Our church asked us to play along, and the American church, despite all of its problems, was there for us, and it was a refuge for us in many respects, because our Catholic faith always was that kind of thing that brought us back to our cultural roots. When you have mass migration of people, especially as the world is becoming more pluralistic, you want to find something that is familiar, that reminds you of the things that you love and cherish, that you find great value in within your culture. And I think pluralism in America has tried to break down a lot of those structures. And I think we're seeing some of the after effects of that. So, I mean, that's one example of a much broader story of how I came to be an integralist leader. I would have to get deep into my politics, but I guess I'll leave it at that. Sort of my first experience as a young man, some of the differences I saw culturally within sort of the framework of the American life. Now, as I got older and got caught up in the liberal culture, like so many of us do, I began to gravitate toward a lot of these American principles: freedom, liberty, because they're ingrained in you from a very young age, especially when you're growing up in the 80s in the Ronald Reagan era, right? And I like the Gipper, don't get me wrong. I think the Gipper was cool. I think he's probably one of the best we've ever had, considering, the issues of democracy and what it represents. I remember Reagan kind of being that wise grandfatherly figure that loved the country, and you appreciated that, unlike the vastly progressive leaders we have today that, well, they appear to want to tear down the country and rebuild it into some liberal utopian model. What I find interesting is that, again, as you grow and you mature, you experience life. I said this many times before, and I'll say it again. When I was younger, I was very prideful when I wanted to believe in whatever it is I wanted to believe in, whatever my motivations were, whether they were, again, how should I say this? Whether they were selfish ambitions or whether they were, from my perspective, a principle of truth. And that is, at my age, dealing with illness, sickness, things of that nature, I don't have the luxury to be stubborn. I don't have the luxury to be wrong anymore. I go where truth takes me. And let me tell you, when you say you're integralist like I am, you are beyond a minority. Very few people understand you and think you're crazy oftentimes. And maybe that's the case. Maybe I have lost my marbles. But here's what I do know is that I come from a strong familial line. And that's something that has sort of extrapolated out in my personal life with my own family. And if we're comparing the virtues of the old world versus the virtues of today, I would argue I'm not the one using liberty to justify all my sins. And see, that's the real battle that conservatives have, right? I mean, we know that the left has gone batshit crazy, excuse my language, right? And there's some nefarious elements there, I believe, of a spiritual nature that is guiding the far left now. I think the right has been duped in many respects because they've taken certain principles of truth, right? I mean, when we talk about self-autonomy, when we talk about freedom, when we talk about liberty, there are some elements of truth there, right? Even God affords us his liberty, but it's an ordered liberty toward a certain purpose, toward a certain end, not liberty as a means to an end to do what I want. I mean, if the question is, and this is just one example, if the question is freedom of speech is a fundamental right, okay, agreed to a certain extent, in the sense that if freedom of speech means speaking up against true oppression, speaking up in favor of the good, the common good, I'm in favor of it. But if freedom of speech means blasphemy, if freedom of speech means the right to slander and calumnize, like we've seen from the mainstream media, now we got a problem. If freedom of speech gravitates toward the area of mortal sin and it contradicts the virtues of God, we have a problem with free speech, right? Is pornography free speech? Supreme Court has ruled that. I don't really care if it's been liberal courts. If it was a bunch of Masons like some people charge, that's fine. The American structure is what the American structure is. If porn and blasphemy, slander, calumny, all these mortal sins are protected under the guise of free speech, we got problems. And the irony of it all is, it is these very vices under the guise of free speech that is destroying America today, but even more so, destroying the very values of the political right today. I mean, just one example again, take the mainstream media that constantly lies and slanders about conservatives, right? They've played their role in tearing down American values. Again, using mortal sin under the guise of free speech. Is free speech a good thing? If properly ordered, it can be. But if mortal sin isn't taken into account, like many classical liberals don't account for because they've broken away from true faith and true religion, their free speech could be damaging. It could be destructive in our society. And we've seen that. The fact that American civilization is so off course now, and we don't relate back to some of these principles that we have cherished as a good, but these principles have been used to tear down truth and justice. And we don't want to do that because that means we need a moral arbiter of truth. And that is the greatest problem that we have today as Americans. We don't have a moral arbiter of truth. You know why? Because we have self-autonomy. The individual reigns in America. And if the individual decides to rewrite the moral codes, the moral laws to serve himself, well, that's his freedom, right? And we're seeing that in America, in American culture, in every respect. So, listen, there's a lot more to get into, but these are some of the ideas that began to work in my mind and how I came to conclude that post-Enlightenment civilization, liberal civilization, secular civilization has a lot of problems. And these are questions that really a lot of Americans can't answer other than, okay, let's all just become libertarians, right? Because that's the answer now from the right. It really is. It's the like, okay, we know we're not getting along with the left. Let them do what they do, and we will do what we do, and we don't cross each other's property lines, and we don't bother each other. Well, that's a problem because see, here's the problem the right has. Post-Enlightenment, post-Masonic revolutions, post-liberal revolutions. Name one nation that has been consumed by the liberal revolutionaries, by Masonic revolutions, that has not become some sort of quasi-Marxist state. Can you name me one? Because even America now, listen, and I'm not making this up, it is the right. It is conservatives telling me, well, America's turning Stalinist. I'm not saying it, conservatives are saying this. Remember, I'm not the one calling for revolution. I'm not doing any of that. You ask my opinion about the problems of society and what the answers are, pick up your rosary. That's what I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you pick up a gun and go kill somebody, because that is the perpetual revolution of the classical liberals. A revolution and a rebellion that never ends, a cycle that never ends. And is that same attitude of, okay, we're going to pick up our guns to go take back our liberties. That's the problem we have today, because now we have a progressive wing of what was once a classical liberal society that is claiming freedom, liberty, revolution, and rebellion at every turn. The problem is the moment you reject the moral arbiter of truth, which God left us, the Catholic Church, that's it, that's all we have through our history. The moment you reject the church, and this is the biggest problem that the New World has, that post-enlightenment world has, then who is the moral arbiter of truth to determine right from wrong? Who calls fair and foul? Who calls good and evil? Who says something is a virtue or something is a sin? Nobody, got nobody left. You say, well, what about the Bible? The Bible. Look at what the Protestants have done with the Bible. It's not like there's any doctrinal unity within Protestantism. They can't even tell you what's right and wrong. They got 40,000, 50,000 denominations all arguing over what is right and what is wrong. Again, once you reject the visible authority left by Christ, and we have evidence for that, historical evidence, archaeological evidence, we have the written record, we have a 2,000-year analogy of the faith that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ, where Holy Mother Church, the Catholic Church, is the one true visible church established by Christ on Peter the Rock. Once you deny that church, who determines right from wrong? This is where Americans and liberal society loses it all. This is why our culture has become unraveled. Our politics is corrupt, and the family is in an utter state of decimation. Until, as Americans, we begin to ask some of these questions, which we've never been asked. Listen, when I used to talk to conservatives about faith and religion and the importance of Catholicism, they would blow that off and say, oh, come on, Frank, the Reformation's over, religious wars is over, we got religious liberty. Just let everybody believe what they want to believe. We got religious liberty. Let's not haggle over religion anymore, because we can't solve those problems anyways. Well, guess what? We're not solving any problems. We're becoming vastly more liberal, and it's precisely because we have no doctrinal unity on principles of truth. Is why we can't get our culture in order and why the family is destroyed. And as in the sort of the gears of democracy, the biggest scoundrels always rise to the top. Because at the end of the day, we're just electing people that are going to appease our fallen nature as we dwell in sin. And as our human nature is broken, we're just electing those and putting those in power that we want in power. They're going to give us what they want. That's why American politics looks so broken now, that even conservatives are questioning, what do we do here at this point in history? So these are the arguments. These are some of the positions. Again, very simple here, because this is a broad argument. And this is something I constantly talk about on this cast, that many Americans don't want to deal with. All truth starts with true faith and true religion. If you circumvent the faith, the 2,000-year analogy of the faith, if you circumvent Jesus Christ from your greater political, social, and national structures, it's only a matter of time before everything breaks apart. And this is where we're at in the West. The more we have deviated away from the old world and the principles that put the church and Christ as the head of culture and politics, the more we've descended into chaos in the West. And this is undeniable now. And simply saying, Constitution thump, Constitution thump, Constitution thump, it's not an answer anymore. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I guess I'll label this one as when did I first start seeing, I guess, the infancy stages of my move toward integralism, because it has been a lifelong journey for me. It has, through lots of experiences. I can articulate these experiences. I mean, listen, I can sit here and tell you about my days in college and how I saw things. Much different, because I was a young conservative, but in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, and when I was going to college, and while I was thumping the right wing, or towing the right wing line, I began to see fallacies right away. But again, we don't know anything different. We're Americans. There's a left and there's a right. And all of our history, particularly with classical liberal historians at the helm, have been geared to put us in this left and right paradigm, dichotomy, whatever you want to call it. And everything works from that given framework. One of the things I'm going through right now is a deep study into World War II. And how, for one, classical liberals make it such a black and white issue, when in fact, when you look at World War II, it's a very nuanced situation, especially how we got to World War II, right? But that's for another cast, that's for another time. So again, the embracement of liberalism without true faith and true religion, I think is the culprit of why things are breaking down. I saw this at a very young age, as a very young boy. Not that I was smart, I was a dumb kid, but I was raised to understand basic concepts of family and virtue within the realm of the Catholic faith. And that's where I began to see those errors. You know, some Catholics just went along with the ride, with the liberal ride, right? Just freedom, liberty, let's have fun, materialism, good times, comforts, pleasures, the money, right? That's what we do as Americans. I've always been different. That's all I can say. And I'm going to do a show here that highlights where I believe our civilization has gone off course by rejecting the old world Christendom that built our civilization. And as we morph into this liberal, godless, secular thing that we do now, that's where the problems lay. I think the answers are, I don't want to say go back to the past, because going back to the past is not that easy, right? We kind of got to move forward, but we got to move forward in a way where truth is revealed, where truth kind of leads us in that respect. And through our experiences, we can avoid the mistakes of the past. And the first of which we need to get straightened out is religious truth, doctrinal truth, the Gospels of Jesus Christ. And what America, I think, is known for, especially being of European descent, is Americans have bastardized religion through the concept of religious liberty. And no, I don't think it's just a moral clause that the founding fathers put in place, or should I say not, a conscious clause, excuse me. It's more than that. We saw the early days of the American Republic and how Americans post-colonialism, or the colonial era, reacted to the concept of religious liberty. They said, I get to make up any God I want. That's why we begin to have all the kooky denominations of Protestantism within America. That's undeniable. That's a historical fact. It's something you never saw in the old Catholic world. There were splinters, Protestantism rose, but even Protestantism never got as kooky as it did in America, because it had a Catholic past and a Catholic history that needed to be respected, even when the Protestant reformers in Europe disagreed with it, right? But in America, I mean, don't get me wrong, Catholicism was here, but it was not the bedrock of its, again, political and cultural structures. And so how religion formed later on across a vast, again, agricultural, landmass in North America, well, that had its ramifications. But there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Integralism, a little indication as to where I'm coming from, some examples, and I'll continue to give you more stories, and I hope you care to listen. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.